In Restoration England, there were plenty of interesting and rather vivid characters. And in this video, I want to share with you the life story of one such character, arguably one of the most egregious of Charles II's subjects, a clergyman called Titus Oates, a man who presented himself as a great arbiter of morals and even as a saviour of the nation, but was in fact odious in the extreme and made a profession of serial lying. In order to understand how Oates came to prominence in this period, we need to understand a little of the turmoil that confronted Charles II when he returned to England in 1660. The England of the second half of the 17th century, recovering as it was from civil war, was strongly divided along religious lines. The majority of people were happy to conform to the religious settlement of the Church of England and to the Book of Common Prayer, but many Puritan Protestants, Anabaptists, Separatists and Independents were not prepared to do so. A sizable minority of the nation were still Catholics. Some of these were recusants who refused to conform to the established church and faced fines for doing so, while others were church papists, happy to outwardly conform while inwardly guarding their consciences. Following the Great Fire of London in 1666, rumours began to spread, encouraged by the Puritans, that the fire had been deliberately started by Catholic agitators, and there developed in the capital an increasing paranoia about Catholic plots against the Crown. This paranoia developed into a crisis in the middle of the 1670s when it became apparent that James, Duke of York, the King's brother and his heir presumptive, had converted to Catholicism. James converted much against the King's will in 1668 or 1669, and he initially kept his conversion quiet. However, amid increasingly anti-Catholic feeling, Parliament introduced a Test Act in 1673, which made it impossible for any Catholic to hold a public office. Under the terms of this Act, which was only repealed in 1829, office holders, and the Duke was one, were obliged to receive the sacrament in a Church of England parish church and take an oath to uphold the royal supremacy of the Church and to reject the Catholic doctrine of transubstantiation before they could be confirmed in office. And the Duke of York refused to do so, thus revealing his conversion and fomenting a major constitutional crisis called the Exclusion Crisis, with many agitating for a bill in Parliament that would exclude the Duke from the throne on account of his religion. Which brings us on to the odious Titus Oates. In 1678, Oates made a series of startling claims that prominent Catholics were plotting to kill Charles II. Amid the unfathomable hysteria that ensued in the wake of what became known as the popish plot, a number of innocent Catholic men were executed on the basis of Oates' fantastical testimony. Now, Titus Oates appeared on the scene in 1678 from relative obscurity. He was the son of a radical Anabaptist preacher who in 1660 had conformed himself to the Church of England and had been instituted as the rector of All Saints in Hastings. A lazy and unmotivated scholar, Titus, who was not in the least honourable as his name suggests, was blessed with a prodigious memory and an ability to talk, and unbounding quantities of self-confidence and self-righteousness. This would prove a somewhat toxic combination of gifts and personality traits. As a youth, he had decided that the best way to get on in life was to use those gifts and to brazenly lie and cheat. Educated for his earlier years at home, he was enrolled as a pupil at the Merchant Taylors' School, but was expelled for cheating his master William Smith out of his fees. Despite this inglorious academic record, he proceeded in 1667 to Gonville and Caius College in Cambridge, but was sent down from there, likely due to his immoral sexual behaviour. He ended his Cambridge career at St John's and left in 1669 with no degree. Despite having no qualifications, he somehow managed to sweet-talk a bishop into ordaining him, and he was ordained as a deacon in 1669 to a curacy at Theydon Bois in Essex. He was ordained as a priest in May of 1670, not by his own bishop, the Bishop of London, Humphrey Henchman, but by Bishop Benjamin Laney of Ely. And in May of 1673, he was instituted as the Vicar of Bobbing in Kent, in the Diocese of Canterbury, at which time he was falsely claiming to have a Cambridge MA. He appears to have resigned the following year after falling out with his parishioners, and unable to find another parish, he moved back to Hastings, where he then served as assistant curate to his father. And while in Hastings, he decided that he quite fancied being the headmaster of the local grammar school, and in Easter of 1675 he set about it in the most despicable manner. He attempted to clear the way for his appointment by committing his first major act of perjury. With no concern as to the effect of his actions, he accused the headmaster of the school, William Parker, of committing buggery with his pupils. Then, in a characteristically outrageous act, Oates had an ability to always go a bit too far. He then accused Parker's father, who was the mayor of Hastings, of uttering in his hearing treasonable words against the king. Now, both of these alleged crimes by father and son were capital offences in English law. Oates must already have had a bit of a poor reputation in Hastings, as nobody believed his lies and both cases were dismissed. Oates then finds that the tables are turned against him, and facing an action for damages from the younger Parker, he is bound over to face charges of perjury at the assizes. Rather than facing the law, Oates then fled to London, signing up as a naval chaplain, and he set sail on a ship called the Adventure to Tangier. His naval career was short-lived, for in 1676 he is dismissed after being accused of buggery himself. On returning to Hastings, he is arrested to face the charges of perjury, but as slippery as an eel, he somehow manages to escape a second time and head to London. There he quickly obtains a post as chaplain in the household of Henry Howard, 1st Earl of Norwich, but is equally swiftly dismissed. Scraping along in poverty, he then takes to begging from Catholic priests in London, and it is during this time that he formulates a peculiar plan for his own self-preservation. In March of 1677, he appears to have been received into the Catholic Church, and the following month he makes the acquaintance of Father Richard Strange, the English provincial of the Jesuits. Oates was seemingly very plausible and personable on first meeting, and he made an art of flattery, and that is how he gained so many positions and opportunities. And Strange is clearly taken in by Oates and believes his conversion to Catholicism to be sincere, and suggests to him that he go and study at the English Jesuit College at Valladolid in Spain, with the aim of entering the Jesuit order. By the time he met Strange, Oates had carefully formulated a mythology for himself, that he was a promising young clergyman with a rich living who had given up everything to convert to the true faith. Not everyone was so readily taken in by Oates. Arriving in July of 1677 at Valladolid, the rector of the college quickly discovered that Oates' Latin was negligible and he was expelled. Returning to England, Oates began to claim that during his brief sojourn on the continent, he had been awarded a doctorate from the University of Salamanca, a claim he continued to make for the rest of his life. Back in England, the spurious Dr. Oates convinced Strange to arrange a further opportunity for him abroad, and he was then sent to the seminary at Saint-Omer near Calais. And once again it became quickly apparent that he was an unsuitable student. Not only was he ignorant of Latin, but was foul-mouthed and bad-tempered too. A contemporary description of Oates paints the picture of a rather sad character. He was repellent within and without, It reads, "He was short, with bowed legs and broad shoulders, topped by a bull neck and a large moon-faced head. His eyes were small and deep-set beneath a low, heavy brow. His mouth was more of a slit that bisected his purple face, and his chin long and monstrous. He spoke not so much with a voice, but with a rasping whine or an insolent bark." In June of 1678, he was expelled from Saint-Omer by Strange's replacement as provincial of the Jesuits, Thomas Harcourt. Oates then returned to London, feeling slighted and ready for revenge on the Jesuit order who had rejected him. Now in 1677, on his first trip to London, he had made the acquaintance of an eccentric Puritan clergyman called Israel Tong, and on his return to London in July or August of 1678, he made contact with Tong once again. Sadly mentally ill, Tong was an obsessed anti-Catholic who laid the ills of the whole world squarely at the door of the Jesuits. Oates began to spin a far-fetched anti-Jesuit tale and found in Tong a ready hearer. Oates claimed that he was aware of a Jesuit plot to murder Charles II and his brother the Duke of York, and he claimed that he had been a trusted servant of the Jesuits and had worked as a messenger between them and other prominent Catholics, and to have been present in the thick of the plotting. He alleged he had been present at a secret meeting held by the Jesuits in April of 1678 at the White Horse Inn in London, at which the plot was hatched. It was, of course, all pure fiction. Oates couldn't have been where he said he was, as he was then in Saint-Omer, but it seems that, like many a fantasist, he had begun to believe his own lies. Now, Tong was keen to inform the king of these revelations from Oates, and in August of 1678, encouraged by his friend Charles Kirby, who was the court chemist, he approached the king during the King's Daily Walk in St James's Park. Now, the king was dubious from the outset, but he put the matter into the hands of his First Minister, the Earl of Danby, who then interrogated Tong. Tong encouraged Oates to swear a deposition of the facts before a magistrate called Sir Edmund Godfrey, so that they might be taken more seriously, and he readily did so. Again, another indication that he might well have believed his own tales. At the end of September, both Tong and Oates were interviewed by the Privy Council and the King, and once again the King gave their story little credence. But among the Privy Councillors were many, including Danby, who had ears to hear. Having garnered the attention and notice he was clearly seeking, Oates was then emboldened, and he further elaborated his story. His initial list of revelations to Tong contained 43 accusations, but he expanded these to 81. He appears to have been encouraged to do so by Danby. In the climate of fear existing in London in the 1670s, people were quite prepared to believe any anti-Catholic hyperbole, however absurd. Oates was summoned before the House of Commons to be interrogated, and he found there a very ready hearing. Like many a consummate liar, his delivery of his evidence was impressive, and he was confident in the witness box. Emboldened and encouraged by the Commons, Oates accused 5 Catholic lords of being ringleaders in the plot: Lords Bellasis, Peter, Powis, Stafford and Arundel. Despite the King's protests, the 5 lords were arrested on Oates' say-so and confined in the Tower of London. When in October of 1678 Sir Edmund Godfrey, who had taken Oates' initial deposition, was found murdered, Oates exploited that as evidence that the Catholics were out to destroy him. He found an unscrupulous confidence trickster called William Bledlow, who was quite happy to lie on his behalf and say that he had met Godfrey's murderers and that they were all Catholics. In the end, Oates' elaborate deception became rather too complicated even for him to keep track of. William Bledlow took to the stand before Parliament and accused the Queen, Catherine of Braganza, of plotting with her physician to poison the king, and Oates then confirmed it. Even to a populace gripped with anti-Catholic hysteria, it was far too implausible that the Queen would attempt to murder her own husband. The king, sceptical from the outset, interviewed Oates himself in November of 1678 and found his testimony wanting and then ordered his arrest. However, doing so then caused a constitutional crisis and a direct clash between the king and the Commons, which Charles was keen to avoid, and so Oates was released. Riding the crest of a wave between 1678 and 1681, Titus Oates' false evidence in a string of trials would tragically result in the execution of at least 35 innocent Catholic men. Oates, loving all the limelight, relished in his newfound fame. He referred to himself as the saviour of the nation, and it is quite certain he believed he was. He was granted by Parliament an allowance of £40 a month and the use of an apartment in the Palace of Whitehall, which must have galled the King and the Duke of York. The College of Arms even granted Oates a coat of arms. Apparently, serial lying can make one a gentleman. But the high times were not to last for Oates. It is bewildering how quickly public perception could change in the gossipy world of Restoration London. In 1681, people began to doubt the plausibility of Oates' testimony. In 1683, he accused the Duke of York of being a traitor, and in the following year the Duke proceeded against him in the courts. Oates then fled to the continent, but was detained in Amsterdam, and in May of 1684, having refused to plead, he was fined £100,000 and incarcerated. In October and December of 1684, he was then charged with perjury. Charles II died in February of 1685, and James, Duke of York, now King James II, took no time in bringing his accusers to trial. Oates was tried on the 8th and 9th of May 1685, only a week or so after the King's coronation. And sitting in judgment upon him was the most notorious judge of his generation, George Jeffreys, who was Chief Justice of the King's Bench and was known even in his lifetime as the hanging judge. At his trial in Westminster Hall, Oates conducted his own defence with his usual confidence, but he was no match for Judge Jeffreys. Oates was convicted and defrocked, and had Jeffreys been allowed to do so by law, he would have hanged him. Instead, Oates was sentenced to life imprisonment, along with a whole host of humiliating punishments, including public whipping 5 times a year in different parts of London. This hideous ordeal was designed to ensure that Oates didn't survive in prison for too long. On the day of his conviction, he was brought into Westminster Hall with a paper label on his head that read, "Titus Oates, convicted upon full evidence of 2 horrid perjuries." He was placed in a pillory in New Palace Yard, and a large crowd pelted him with rotten eggs. He was then tied to a cart and whipped the distance between Aldgate and Newgate. Remarkably, Oates survived his ordeal, and with the Glorious Revolution, the flight of James II, and the accession of William and Mary, he was released from prison in December of 1688. He soon fell foul of the authorities again and was back in prison by the end of 1689, after refusing to give up his claim to have a doctorate from Salamanca. Although still a convicted perjurer, his conviction was never overturned. William III restored his pension in 1689, and Oates set himself up in a house in Westminster. He occupied his time writing anti-Catholic polemic, and he appears to have considered himself, and told all who would hear it, that he was a martyr for the Protestant cause. In 1693, his pension having stopped, he then married Rebecca Wells, the heiress of a wealthy London merchant. And in 1698, he decided to convert to the Anabaptist faith of his father, and for a while preached at the Baptist church in Virginia Street, always wearing his Anglican clerical dress. His sermons were always ragingly anti-Catholic and pulled in a large crowd. But as always, Oates went too far. He created enemies and he caused chaos in his congregation, and in 1701 the Baptists expelled him. Titus Oates' final years were spent in penury and obscurity. He had burnt through his wife's fortune, and in 1705, in his mid-50s, he died, unloved and unlamented. Thanks for watching. If you enjoy this channel, you're bound to enjoy my magazine, The Antiquary. Published every month, it is a labour of love for me, and in it I explore some of the more obscure aspects of our shared history, all beautifully illustrated in full colour. It ships across the world, is offered in print and digital format, and readers give it 5 stars on Google. If you love your history like me, particularly the history of objects, buildings, people and places, why not consider subscribing? Subscribing helps support my work and the channel too. There's a link above and in the video description that takes you to the magazine website.